Thank you all very much, and I wanted to welcome you back to the second part of the presentation. And I want us to think about a little bit of the context that we're living in now, where we've come from 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months, whenever you're watching this video, of living through the pandemic and living under lockdown, and how our cities have either enabled that or inhibited that and facilitated responding to COVID-19 and the physical circumstances, the social circumstances that we find ourselves in, and whether or not we're still able to respond to our livelihood, our health, our transportational, our social issues that we all have. And if you think about this question as I'm going through the next series of slides, you'll understand why resilience is important and livability is important, and why we need to create livable cities in order to respond to the resilience challenges that we're going to be facing in the next few decades, in the next 30, 40, or 50 years. We saw in 2017 about a third of Bangladesh was underwater from flooding. And even though perennial flooding is an issue in Bangladesh and always has been, the melting of the Himalayan ice waters on a seasonal basis has been exacerbated year on year on year, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Paris in 2018 experienced the heaviest rains it had in 50 years. Um, and so it was a 1 in 50-year event, but these events are becoming more and more frequent. We're told that this coronavirus pandemic is 1 in 1,000 year occurrence, so 1 in a century occurrence. But we can understand how such occurrences may be getting more frequent as time goes by. So it may not necessarily be a 1 in 1,000 year event if it happens the next few times over the next few decades. We'll have to wait and see. But our cities certainly should be prepared with increased levels of resilience and improved livability through addressing resilience issues in terms of infrastructure and planning and systems, as well as governance. Hurricane Katrina, Irma, and Jose in the Caribbean in 2017, where 90% of the buildings in Barbuda were destroyed. You can imagine the levels of physical reconstruction necessary to, in what the Sendai framework calls, build back better, so that these events aren't as catastrophic if they happen to occur, and they surely will at some point in the future. But all of these events are caused by our inability as human beings, as settlements, to respond to the increasing threats of carbon dioxide emissions that cause increases in temperature, especially in coastal cities. Now, we may argue and we may say that Lao PDR does not have to worry about that because it's not an oceanic city. It has no oceanic cities. However, its proximity, and all three cities lie along the Mekong. Uh, there is a relationship, of course, between flooding of the Mekong, sea level rises in the South China Sea, uh, that will affect all of these cities. And of course, as temperature and as carbon dioxide emissions increase, as deforestation continues to plague the Laotian countryside, we know that these will have a direct impact on the resilience and the livability of the three cities that we're concerned with. In terms of how our three cities and how cities throughout the GMS can respond to the challenge, we know that global temperature rises over the past few decades, since 1850 at least, have been increasing. 2014 was the hottest year on record globally until that happened in 2015. And then it happened again in 2016. So what we understood as occurrences, as recurring cycles of 1 in 10, 1 in 50 year occurrences, are now happening more and more frequently. And the fact that they're happening more frequently means that we need to be better prepared, more resilient, and improve the livability, not only in terms of what citizens and stakeholders require today, but what we can project the needs of the cities to be in the next few decades. In terms of responding to air pollution, we know that approximately 3 million deaths occur per year as a result of increased air pollution. Health expenditures top 21 billion US dollars per year globally. One out of four megacities, the vast majority of which are in the ADB subregion, face water stresses. Urban heat island affects 11% of cities' GDP by the year 2100, and all of these have an impact on us at the individual and household level. We've seen in Moscow in 2017 that the thunderstorms resulted in 13 dead, 148 injured, with wind speeds of 28 meters per second, which most of the buildings in Laos would not be able to respond or withstand. This year alone, early this year, before the pandemic hit, we saw the heat waves and the fires in Australia as well as Russia devastate vast tracts of land. And of course, all of this is topped off by the coronavirus and the pandemic that we've seen occurring and plaguing all of our cities, all of our households, affecting us individually and affecting the countries that we live in. So the challenge has to be how to respond to these occurrences as their frequencies and intensities will continue to rise over the coming decades. What is it that we can do as engineers, as planners, as architects, as finance specialists, and as city managers to improve the livability of cities and ensure their resilience? The Rockefeller Foundation 100 Resilient Cities definition of urban resilience is the capacity of individuals, you and I, communities, where we live, institutions, businesses, and systems, which means city governments, within a city to A, survive, B, adapt, and C, grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks we experience. So that means that rather than be in a lockdown predicament or a lockdown circumstance as a result of, for example, COVID, we're not just thinking about surviving. We have to have an adaptation mentality, but more so a growth mentality. So, are we able to grow during periods of seasonal or recurring shocks and shocks and shocks, as well as stresses, to ensure that individually, from a human, from a social development, from an economic point of view, that we are growing as societies, as individuals, as communities, and as institutions, no matter what the threats are. So it's a very, very tall challenge and an extremely critical one to ensure that we're not just sustaining, we're not just surviving, we're actually thriving under these circumstances. And if we look at a framework, a planning framework for how other cities have done it, we see that there's actually a concerted effort and thinking that goes into uh, what improves resilience and what improves livability within cities. If we look at the urban systems about and consider what systems are in place, the how and the willingness of how cities are managed and can grow and develop and thrive. We understand that there's a dynamic urban governance where there's a relationship between master planning, between engineering, between financial planning, and the decision-making structures at the local authority level, and how local authorities engage, consult, liaise, and interact with ministries such as the DHU. So the idea is that this is fluid. The idea is that we have a dynamic sense of urban governance and integrated approaches to master planning and development, that we're thinking long term, that we're responding to the flexible needs of the future, that we're executing and implementing and delivering very, very effectively, and that we're innovating through the use of information technology, through the use of different stakeholder engagement processes, through responding to the taxpayer base, as well as ensuring that there's financial sustainability in the longer term, to all ensure that what's at the top of the pyramid, which is what we spoke about in session one, Maslow's hierarchy, that we have higher quality of life, that we respond to city competition, not only in terms of the city economy, but also in terms of other social aspects such as infrastructure, social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, cinema, music, concert venues, and so on, as well as foster what we call a sustainable environment. Now, if we look at the livability matrix, and this is based on the Mercer 2016 Quality of Living Survey, we know and understand that different cities lie at different quadrants of the livability matrix. So the quadrant is broken down into four sectors, where the left side is the livability ranking, which is an arbitrary ranking from a very high number to a very low number, and then urban population density. So the idea is that we build high density, highly livable cities, because we know that Luang Prabang and Pakse are not going to be able to sustain their current levels of urban sprawl for perpetuity. That in the next 50 years, and I'm going to get to this slide, in the next 50 years, we know that the population is going to increase by anywhere between 3.5 to 5 times their current population. And so we have to be able to put in place the systems and plans and processes now to anticipate those changes. And so what we want to move to is a high density, highly livable city. So if you look at the high density, high livable cities, they're very famous ones, as we know: Singapore, Hong Kong, London, and Tokyo. But we also see some very famous cities on there, like New York and Paris and Sydney and Vancouver in Canada. Now, embarrassingly, I am the city that I live in right now is at the bottom left quadrant, which means that it's very low population density and low livability. Nairobi is extremely low livability in terms of this particular ranking, but in other rankings, in my personal circumstances, it's extremely high livability. So what we see here is that if we look at the left side of the graph, we can imagine the lower left quadrant. We can imagine that many of the three cities within the PPS, the Lao Livability Cities program funded by CDIA, are actually in the lower left quadrant. And what we want to achieve is in the upper right-hand quadrant, high density, high livability cities. But just because we achieve that, as we can see by the red and orange arrows, there's no guarantee that that trajectory will keep on continuing. There's a need for a concerted, ongoing effort to ensure that the cities remain high livability and high density. Why are we trying to build livability into the investments that we're talking about? Because the investments need to continue to provide benefits and deliverability over a period of time. It's not just what we need in 2020 that we're looking at, but as planners and architects and engineers and finance specialists and as city managers, the decision now rests with you as to what you want to see achieve and delivered in your three cities that will sustain the needs of the cities over the next 20 to 30 years. We don't want to just make decisions about the PPS investments of what the cities need now and what you alone think the cities need, but we want to understand what are the needs of industry, what are the needs of poor as well as less poor households, what are the needs of civil society, what are the needs of academic and training institutions, and how will these needs change over the next 30 or 40 or 50 years, and how will the needs change based on the existing social, economic, as well as environmental conditions that are more than likely to change over the next 20 to 30 years. So this starts from what we call the vulnerability assessments that we've done, the identification of specific actions to build resilience into the investments, and then the project preparation side, which is stage two, doing the pre-feasibility studies and the preparation of detailed project reports and, for example, solid waste management and drainage, for example, sewage treatment, and then finally looking to financing, shopping from a variety of donors and IFIs, including the Asian Development Bank, as well as national schemes and other donors, to look for implementable financing mechanisms to deliver the investments. And in this way, we can look at the key sectors of solid waste management, wastewater, sewage, and urban planning and say, these are the needs right now, and we are going to select a specific range of initiatives now, but we also are looking to future needs as well. So for example, there's a mass tree planting initiative that is occurring throughout Lao PDR, and you need to ask yourself that in response to the growing threat of climate change, of soil degradation, of riverbank erosion along the Mekong, what can the planting of 2 million, 5 million, 10 million trees over the next 3 years actually do to improve and respond to the ability and the threats of climate change, improve resilience, and create more livable cities. Because what we know is that if we look at without livability plans, and of course in 2020 the populations of all three cities are going to be relatively static. But over time, if we have livability plans, what we will expect to see is higher populations in the cities, but lower surface areas of the city. So it's not the population that we should be guided by. The population is there to allow us to think about the number of households we will have and the number of people that need to be connected, for example, to solid waste management services, to wastewater treatment services, to water supply services, to cycle paths, to alternative forms of urban transport, for example. These are the reasons that the population figures exist. Uh, Unlike our previous training, that implies the population is proportional to the land area that these cities occupy. We have to get rid of that way of thinking and start to think about building denser Luang Prabangs, denser Pakses, and denser Savanakets, because that is what's going to improve the level of resilience and increase the livability of these cities with the right range of social, cultural, educational, and other human amenities that we all need to survive. But what we can see by this chart is that the city's population are going to triple over the lifetime of the planning horizon of the investment. So by 2050, we're going to have at minimum 3 times the population in each of the cities. Arguably, it could be 3.5 or even 5 times. And that's why we want to move towards the right-hand corner of this graph in the upper right-hand quadrant, because we know that creating higher density means lower cost per unit serviced and higher livability, because we will have uh, improved parks, improved cycle paths, improved pedestrian areas, lower levels of reliance on motorized transport and individual motor vehicles, which is extremely high in Laos as it is throughout the GMS. But what we're seeing globally is that in cities like Hong Kong, London, Tokyo, and Singapore, as well as all those cities to the right-hand side of the graph, they have a very low reliance on motorized transport, particularly individually owned motor vehicles. So there's a need to move away from building high feeder roads. We need to look at rural roads. We need to look at small laneways and the connection of these laneways to urban parks, urban cycle paths, and pedestrianized systems of transport within each of the three cities. So with that, let me get to some specific initiatives that you have the flexibility in designing how much and the extent of these improvements in each of the cities to create livability by responding to the resilience needs. So we know that in Pakse, Pakse has a strategic plan, Pakse has a physical plan, as well as a zoning plan. But what we need is a prioritization of the linear and recreational parks so that we can increase the levels of investment there to ensure that we're responding to the SDGs, to ensure that during periods of seasonal flooding, we have opportunities for groundwater recharge, for example. And that is something that you as city engineers, as city planners, as city architects, as finance specialists need to think about. What are the specific mobility and circulation routes that you need to delink and decouple from the roadways to ensure there's improved cycle as well as pedestrian movement, and that the vehicular movement is now going to be more than likely a thing of the past. In 20 years, can you imagine everybody owning a vehicle in Pakse? It's unlikely. Vehicle ownership is probably going to decrease, and so the need and the reliance on roadways is also going to decrease. And so, in terms of your livability investments, that has an impact because there's a need to create, for example, an outer ring road perhaps, improve the bus terminals, respond to specific floodplains, and ensure that the linear park systems are well connected to neighborhoods, to city amenities, and that uh, pedestrianized improvements and pedestrianized areas are also increased. The extent of this is what we're here to decide today and what we want to ask you. Traditionally, the question has always been put to the consultants. What do you think we should do? But what the consultants are telling you is that this is your Pakse. You, as well as the stakeholders, the city constituents, private industry, industrialists, individual stakeholders, social and community based organizations, academia, all have to collectively decide what the future Pakse needs are going to be. But I can assure you that understanding the global trends in many of the world's cities, it's going to be less of a reliance on individually motorized transport and more of a reliance on pedestrianized movement as well as non-motorized vehicles such as electric buses, such as bicycles, and so on. In terms of Kaysone Phomvihane Savannakhet, we know that again, a strategic plan and a physical plan exists. The zoning plan needs to be better detailed. And there's extensive emphasis on technical disciplines, but more of a need for a focus on interdepartmental understanding of how these disciplines relate to financial viability and institutional and operational viability and maintenance in the longer term needs to be paid. So there's a need to look at uh, cross-departmental, cross-disciplinary understanding of how to manage the city. Certainly, you've expressed a priority that the ring road is important to you. And so there's a need to improve the ring road. It will contribute to livability, but it's not under the scope of this PFS series of investments, unfortunately. However, there's a need to look at the mobility and circulation as it's de-linked to vehicular movement, and that's certainly within the scope of this PPS. And the pedestrianized and non-motorized approach is also necessary, as well as thinking about how we can rehabilitate the historic and urban core as as Luang Prabang has, and a comprehensive package of improvements at the urban center that can look to rejuvenate the city, create the night markets, create the public spaces necessary to improve livability, as well as improve the overall social and cultural resilience of the city. So if we look at some of the initiatives, for examples, there are safety improvements in terms of guardrails, in terms of improved bridges for road areas. There's a focus on improving the Old Town area, and we've also got interest by ADF in improving the historic core, but looking at opportunities such as night markets and how those would connect to the public park extension, how those opportunities would then connect uh, to internal cycle paths, to internal pedestrianized areas, as well as looking at expanding the level of rural roads or feeder roads, tertiary and secondary roads within the city, because those need to be paved in order to give people better access by cycle, by foot to other areas, other geographic areas of the city, and thereby decrease the reliance on individually motorized transport, increase the reliance on buses and cycling and other non-motorized forms of transport, for example. So, in a nutshell, these are the types of improvements we see in Kaysone Phomvihane, but the extent of these improvements is something for you to decide. So, the number of parks, the types of activities within the parks that actually encourage safety, respond to the needs of women, especially at night. So, street lighting is going to be particularly important. Having opportunities for informal as well as formal trading so that all city residents and all city stakeholders are actually included in the development and resilience and livelihood opportunities at the urban level. Luang Prabang by far attracts the vast majority of investment, but there's a need to balance the need of Luang Prabang against the needs of the other two cities. And so the MFF facility is flexible and allows the scope and the breadth over time to respond to the needs of the other two cities. If they're not ready for particular investments now, we can schedule investments in 2 or 3 years from now to actually absorb that particular investment priority, but it should be scheduled now. Luang Prabang has a protected historic core that is that is a UNESCO heritage site, and so the strategic plan as well as physical plan exists, as well as a cultural UNESCO plan that is protected for a particular geographic area of the city. The zoning plan, like in the other two cities, needs to be further detailed to also consider opportunities for planning. The city is bound by natural geographic features, and so the long-term prospects and opportunities will need to result in the increased vertical densities. However, that's not permitted inside the heritage zone, which is limited to only 4 stories. So the priorities are a range of donors to work in Luang Prabang, and so institutionally, there's a need to coordinate better at the central level, and the city government needs to be able to understand how to coordinate a diversity of projects. But there's been an overt focus on the aesthetic improvements and ensuring that the facades of buildings and the integrity of cultural and historic spaces are maintained without due consideration of how this will improve the lives and livelihoods of local residents. Because the tourist base and the tourist economy of Luang Prabang could be expanded to consider other economic inputs and opportunities, and not just ones based on tourism alone. Remember, in terms of resilience and in terms of livability, we want to create a diversity of opportunities. But what we see in Luang Prabang is that outside the historic core, that there's a need for landfill improvements and the improvement of the existing dump site to a sanitary landfill, the improvement of specific canals and drainage areas so that they can be better integrated to the needs of the city and respond to the needs of tourism as well as other economic and livelihood opportunities throughout the year, not just during the drier seasons. There's also an opportunity to, again, connect the historic core to other areas of the city. And again, we've described how these are perhaps geographically limited because of the valley that Luang Prabang finds itself in. And so there's a need to construct vertically to offer opportunities of increased density. So with that brief um, summary of the second input, the second presentation, I'd like to now move to the third presentation and discuss how other cities have improved livability. What are the examples that we can see from around the world from other cities, and how have these other cities created resilient, viable, connected, inclusive, and competitive opportunities and responded to the livability challenge?